our All Souls podcast. We are so sorry, guys, but our lives actually got in the way of us recording this second wrap episode for A Discovery of Witches. I had, my entire job decided to go up in flames this week. Jen had a surprise paper. There was just not enough time.
There were explosions left and right.
There was not enough time to sleep, eat, take care of ourselves and our families, and also record this podcast. The good news is that we are at a summary phase. You guys don't have to skip any chapters or anything, but we are very sorry for the unscheduled interruption in programming.
Yeah. If you're listening in real time, which, future listeners, hello future, you will have no break at all, so you won't even know what we're talking about.
Maybe there is a time spinner nearby and it's just been restitched appropriately.
Yes. Anyway, we're a week late. That's how it goes.
That's life.
But we thank you for all of your super kind comments and your understanding, because, stuff happens. So
Indeed, and this is supposed to be fun. We talk about witches and vampires for fun, so thank you for allowing us to keep it light and fun and as a side hustle. In any case, this week we are going to talk about some of the wrap discussion that we didn't get a chance to do last episode. So we will be talking about character arcs and what it means to be a good protagonist, what it means to be a good antagonist, some listener questions, some themes, and then we're going to wrap it up with some fun polls that you guys have participated in on Twitter and Facebook over the last couple weeks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we want to start off really quick with just quickly revisiting something from our last wrap discussion, and then we'll move on into the new content. And it was just something from our time travel discussion, and don't worry, we're not going to get into time travel again. Your heads will be saved. And it was that the reason this came up is because The World of All Souls is coming out soon, and Deb released a little snippet about how she came up with the time travel theories for the series. So, and that was that she kind of was inspired by multiverse theory, which we talked about last time, and also the movie Sliding Doors.
Which I love, by the way. If you haven't seen it, it is a Gwyneth Paltrow and I forget who is the male romantic lead, but the premise is basically that you have these two competing universes. In the first one, Gwyneth Paltrow is in a relationship with a really shoddy dude, and in the second one, she walks in on him cheating on her. And the thing that splits the multiverse is her missing the London Tube. Like in one universe, she catches the train, in the other, she does not.
Yeah.
And it's a great movie, or at least I remember it being great. So
I have watched it a little. I've watched it a little bit more recently. I definitely liked it. I did not like the male lead so much, but I liked the concept, and I thought the plot was really cool in that movie. Yeah.
I think the reason I remember liking the male lead is, number one, he was Irish, I think, and then number two, he has this line somewhere in the movie about everyone grows up listening to the Beatles so early that they ought to be called the Feetles, which I thought was hilarious at the time. I was in high school.
And you're like, hey, I get it.
I hear your pun. I see it. I'm into it.
And so the reason that, I decided to bring that up is because... So Deb is saying that she was inspired by the multiverse, by the movie Sliding Doors, which is awesome. It's always interesting to find out what inspires authors to come up with certain things. But I just wanted to say that that's for me as a reader, my interpretation is not of time travel and All Souls is not that it's a multiverse. Which is totally fine. If you're inspired to do time travel and your time travel ends up being something else completely than what your original inspiration was, that's fine. Cool. But, and then we had talked about last time a little bit, sometimes authors mishmashing different time travel theories together, and I said that's not generally a good idea, and I just wanted to clarify that and it's not to say you can't do it, but if it's not done super carefully, and if it's not well executed, it can make the plot really muddy. It just starts to be a lot for the reader to have to carry around through the plot and the series, and it just kind of muddies the waters. So having a more clean-cut idea of what your time travel is tends to work better for your plot.
Right, and That's not to say that any of the choices about how you do time travel are inherently, as a value judgment, bad or good.
Right.
It's just,
right.
Do you care about the internal consistency of your time travel? That is either how it works or how you're choosing to explain it. And since we subscribe generally to the death of the author theory, or the death of the author method of literary criticism, I think that Deb's interpretation of what she thought she was doing, which is to say that the witches have an understanding of time travel that is more like sliding doors and less like this other thing, but at the end of the day it's all magic, is interesting, but I'm not sure to the extent that she is saying, this is what I did when I was writing this series. Is that how it actually works out? I don't know. I think that that is a discussion that we can have later in the books about whether this does actually look like a multiverse or whether it looks like something else.
Right. Yeah. But right now, just with the one book, for me, it does not. And this will be a continuing and evolving discussion.
As all of the best discussions
all
are.
Things are. Anyway, so that's it for time travel. You're welcome.
Are we ready to talk about character arcs?
Yes!
Hooray!
Hooray!
So I think that it makes sense to start with maybe some basic talk about protagonists and antagonists. So when we talk about a protagonist, we're talking about the character around whose growth, change, or action the story actually moves. The person whose character story traces the central narrative conflict most closely. When we talk about the antagonist, we are talking about the person who is exercising pressure on the protagonist and on the story, and the person who is driving that central narrative conflict, because the protagonist says yes and the antagonist says no, and their goals are mutually exclusive. So, for example, the antagonist, or the closest thing we have to like an antagonist singular in this book, is Peter Knox, because he wants the book. Diana also wants the book. They can't simultaneously possess the same book unless we are in a very different story where it comes to a point of like teamwork and understanding and a shifting of perspectives. But I don't think that's the kind of story that we're in. So we'd like to talk a little bit about Diana as a character, and Diana specifically as a protagonist in a successful or unsuccessful.
Okay, I'm ready to do that. I would you also say that in A Discovery of Witches, Satu is like a more minor antagonist just because she does work directly against like what Diana wants, which at the time Diana wants to just stay at Septours and, you know, be in love. And Satu comes in and she's like, "Nope."
Yeah, and I think that I pick Peter Knox for purposes of illustration and discussion, not necessarily because I think he is necessarily the strongest antagonist, and I think it might be worth talking about in those three narrative conflicts that we talked about last episode, identifying what we think the antagonistic pressure on those plots is. I'm just using that one because it is, for me, probably the clearest mutually exclusive goal. Although I think that, you know, for Satu, it could be like Satu wants to know how Diana's magic works, and Diana does not want Satu to know how her magic works or anything about her.
Diana doesn't even want to know how her magic works.
Which loops into our discussion of Diana as a protagonist. Yeah. But, where should we start, do you think?
That's a good question.
Okay, let me start by saying, what do you think makes up Diana's character? Like, if we're looking at her in a vacuum and we're talking about her strengths, weaknesses, vulnerabilities, what do you see?
Okay. Well, in the interest of being strengths-based, we could start there. So, Diana actually does have a lot of, for as much, like, flack as we gave Diana throughout this book, she does have a lot going for her. So she's super intelligent. She is actually brave, although the line of brave and stupid in this book is very thin. She has potential to do all of these things. She has all of these inherent gifts and talents. She has a lot of ambitious. She's very Slytherin, I feel like. She's super ambitious, you know, in her academic life, and she has personal goals that she sets for herself. She attains them. She moves on to the next goal. You know, at the beginning of this book, that's the Diana that we find. So those are all strengths for her.
I think I agree. I think that she also has a great deal of compassion, that she is a very protective person. I think that's something that she and Matthew have in common, you know, in terms of protecting people that she loves once she has let them into her life. I think that we don't begin to see that as much until Matthew comes into her life, but I think there's increased evidence of her motivation to protect other people as the book goes on.
Yeah. And I would say also, like, she has a tendency to see the good side of people, almost to her detriment sometimes when it comes to, like, for example, Matthew, which we can talk about later, but she definitely errs towards, like, being just, like, fiercely loyal to the point where she just, like, doesn't see any faults at all. So, which can be both a strength and a weakness, I guess, in that case.
So when we start with, when we talk about her weaknesses, what do you think are her weaknesses as a character rather than her vulnerabilities? And the distinction I would potentially make is that a weakness is a potentially negative character trait or a character trait that gets her in trouble, and a vulnerability is something that she...
An asset. Or sorry, vulnerability is
more of a thing that she's always carrying and trying to work around, like a thing that she is trying to protect within herself, I think.
Sure. That could be exploited.
Right.
If people knew about
exactly.
it. Yeah. Where the strengths are assets. She's really stubborn, you guys. She's so stubborn that she will, like, just go plunge headlong into things because she has decided it's the right thing to do, and she will not consider any of the outcomes.
And as a result of her stubbornness, I think that she also has remarkable capacity for self-delusion. Like, the way that she talks to herself about things is not often the truth, or at least it is not... It is a version of the world that does not take into account all of the things that have already happened, or, like, she will explicitly block out things that are important.
Yeah. She'll eliminate context and just, like, look at something and she's like, this is great. And you're like, oh, it's not.
I think that what makes her really interesting, though, is how vulnerable she is and how well that vulnerability is captured and bound up in her identity and her fear and her understanding of her magic. Eventually, I think that Matthew becomes a vulnerability for her that is a thing that can be quite skillfully exploited by the wrong people. But the fact that she's both afraid of her magic and afraid of herself and afraid of the kind of person that she will be if she uses magic, I think is a very effective use of vulnerability to access and understand her character.
Right. And I guess another of her vulnerabilities, which we did talk a little bit about, is that she has no idea who she is. She thinks she does at the beginning of the book, but she doesn't. And then she's just, like, so stubborn and just kicking and screaming through the entire thing of this journey of self-discovery for herself, that she's really not interested in personal growth.
Right. Which is why she is an interesting and complicated character with whom to experience a growth character arc. Basically, a character arc where you go from a character who thinks that they know what their goals are and what they should be to a character that's confronted with conflict that says, hey, maybe these shouldn't be your goals, or maybe you should be focused on something else. And she ends up being focused on something that is entirely different from what she was focused on at the beginning of the book. And so I would argue that she goes through a growth arc. Not to say that she doesn't also have some change associated, but the things that are inherently Diana, or maybe just focused on the wrong set of goals at the beginning of the book, or a set of goals that is maybe not leading her to the best version of herself.
Right. or goals that aren't really like reasonable. You know, for half the book, even after she has the interference of the congregation, and even after she's at SEP tours, like her personal goal is to still make her presentation. Not the most reasonable goal.
No, not the most reasonable goal. And not a goal that's like particularly helpful for advancing the plot.
And really not one that's attainable. But that goes back to her like self-delusion where she's like, oh, sure, I'm still going to do that. Like, it's fine.
And I think that it's interesting that we also have a shift in our understanding of Diana from the beginning of the book, where it seems like she just won't do magic, to a point where we understand that she actually can't,
right,
to a large extent.
Although, you know, her saying she won't do magic is also her lying to herself, saying she won't do magic, because she definitely does it when she can justify it to herself. So, which goes, you know, back into her self-delusion a lot, and her taking things out of context, where she's like, in this situation, I never use magic except sometimes when I do the laundry, but that was just the one time, and it's fine.
So what would you say is the thing that changes most about Diana in the course of Discovery of Witches? Or what do you identify as the shape of her arc?
I think, for me, in A Discovery of Witches, she goes from being incredibly and frustratingly reactive to actually being somewhat proactive at the end of the book, which I think is like a really huge deal for her. I mean, alongside of like, yes, she finally decides to learn magic, but as, you know, internally as a character, she finally decides to be proactive and take charge of some of the things in her life. To me, that's her largest area of growth.
Yes. And I think that is tied to her understanding of her identity, and that perhaps the underlying theme of that is that you are able to be proactive when you are honest about who you are and what you want, which is something that she's not at the beginning of the story.
Right. And I think too, tying into what you just said, at the end of Discovery of Witches, I think she transfers like who she is in what she wants to being incredibly tied to being in love with Matthew, which as we develop in this series is going to become really problematic. Like we already said, it is a growth for her and it is a change, but she's still not entirely like accepting of just herself and what she wants. She's tying herself to somebody else, and that person is Matthew. She's like, I'm in love with Matthew. All of these things, you know, the magic and the book and all of this drama and the congregation come along with being in love with Matthew, and therefore I care about them. But at the end of Discovery, which is, I don't know that I can say entirely that she cares because it matters to her.
I would agree with you. And I think that dovetails nicely into the discussion of, you know, what makes a strong protagonist or what makes an interesting protagonist. And that is to say that I don't think there's any doubt in this story that Diana is the protagonist of A Discovery of Witches. Hers is the story around whom all three of the narrative conflicts most explicitly turn. She is the person whose internal development we care about as the story advances. I think that she has specifically some goals type problems. You know, the best goal for a protagonist is it's specific, it's achievable, and there are stakes attached to it. You know, it like matters to her, and it's something that she can actually do in the course of the story that we're telling. And if she suffers from a character issue in Discovery of Witches, it is the lack of a specific and attainable goal.
Right. Yeah. And I think, like, if we're talking about the question, like, is Diana a good protagonist? Is she a bad? You know, not that, like, good and bad, not, like, in value, just in, is she a believable protagonist in A Discovery of Witches? Sometimes she's not. But that's the trouble with a series and a trilogy, which is that you need your main character to have a really long arc, right? So in this book, she's not a great protagonist sometimes. A lot of the time, she's kicking and screaming, or the conflict just leaves her behind. which works in her larger arc, but in this book becomes really difficult.
And also in terms of her stakes, right? And the problem with not having her have stakes, that is something to gain and lose, that is explicitly related at this point to the book, to like the Diana and Matthew versus the world conflict, is that in order to bring that conflict to her, we have to try and kill her. Like, we have
so many times.
Right. We have to inflict so much trauma. And that's not to say that trauma is an important part of story fuel, because it absolutely is. You know, part of Diana's development and her identity is about how she finally processes the trauma from losing her parents and being outside of her own world for so long, into being a person who has the tools to manage that and be in a successful relationship with another person. But in order to get her to the point where she is actually engaging with the central narrative conflict and where she's willing to face it, we have to exploit the trauma she's already experienced and add more.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would add to that and say, like, not only do we have to try to kill her, we have to try to kill Matthew, because she doesn't, as a character in this book, it's difficult to get her to care. Right. And Matthew, by the end of the book, is the thing that she cares about the most. Like, you can threaten any other part of her life, basically, and it's still not going to be very motivational for her. But finally, we tried to kill Matthew, and then, like, you know, she's like, oh, I care. By the end of the book. So,
right, because if you look at what she had before Matthew, you know, she had this career, she had this teaching position, she had this presentation to give, she had these pursuits, and by virtue of the plot of A Discovery of Witches, many of those things get just sort of like swept away or left behind, and she barely bats her eyelashes.
Yeah. And even, I mean, we acknowledge the fact that Matthew and Diana coming to the Bishop house puts a threat on her family, but even that is not like enough to motivate her to actually do something, because they're at, like we talked about, they're at the Bishop house and they're both just like sticking their heads in the sand, just like la-di-dong, even though they know the congregation's a threat. They have now brought the threat to her family, and she's still like, meh. Meh. So yeah, she's very difficult to motivate in this book.
She's difficult to motivate, and she is difficult to... It also makes her difficult to connect with, because the story fuel of the central narrative conflict, having your character interact with that conflict, is what moves your story forward. And because Diana is so unwilling to engage with that conflict most of the time, and or the events of the story happen when she's not present, it is extremely difficult to connect her to that conflict a lot of the time, and it makes her difficult to connect with because she is being kind of absent and self-deluding.
Right. And would you say that it's almost that it's really a case of like her vulnerabilities are so good that they drown her for this book? Like, she is so vulnerable that she can't move around those vulnerabilities to attain growth, right? Like, it almost overwhelms her character.
Yes. I mean, I think that's where I come down on it, because the more that I process how traumatized I believe her to be at the beginning of this book, looking sort of obliquely and spoiler free at the entirety of the series, I think that the arc we end up getting from her is someone who moves from being extraordinarily traumatized to someone who is in command of the entirety of themselves. And that is a really compelling story to tell. It's why I'm here. It's why I love Diana eventually so much. But in this book, like, I feel incredibly sorry for her in how stuck she is in those vulnerabilities.
Yeah. What is the old joke? Like, if you can't love Diana now, you don't get to love Diana in Book of Life.
Right. Maybe that's it. Like,
if you can't love and accept her now, then you can't love and accept her in Book of Life.
Right.
You don't get her at her best.
Right. If you can't,
but she's really difficult. She makes it really hard.
She does make it really hard on successive reads, I think, but that's only because I think that I have become so attuned to her vulnerability that I kind of like want her to like recognize it for what it is much sooner than I think I did on my first or second read. Yeah. Well, and we have the privilege of being, omniscient somewhat now because we've read the entire series and we're reading the book and we can put the pieces together, whereas Diana is a lot of times incapable of putting pieces together because she tends to look at things separately. Indeed. Yeah. And I think that, like, because I know where Diana will end up, I am so frustrated in the first book on successive rereads by the fact that she seems to internally, I think there's a text-based argument for Diana thinking that, like, she knows who she is at the end of book one, that she like has an identity, and what she doesn't realize is how she has cleaved that identity to Matthew and isn't really in full possession of like who Diana is. But she's willing to fight you on that, I think, where she's like, I know my own mind, and my mind is Matthew.
Yeah.
And when really, truly, like, she's come a long way, but she has gone from one way of hiding to another, and that is, I'm just going to stand behind Matthew.
Yeah. And I think that also, in this book, does create a relation, or begins to create a relationship that's super unhealthy, that we've talked about before. Like, tying your identity to another person is not the greatest idea when it comes to romance and long-term relationships. So, and that's what Diana's doing, and it's really difficult to watch her do it because you're like, that is not going to work out.
Well, and maybe this is a good time to start talking about a little bit of Matthew's character arc and saying that the way that Diana plays into some of Matthew's weaknesses is what creates a potentially unhealthy relationship. Essentially, like, some of his character traits that are negative, her behavior is leaning into them in a way that just encourages him to be worst Matthew, in the sense of like the patronizing, overprotective, patriarchal nonsense. She's willing to hide in it, and so like it does nothing to curb those instincts for him. Yeah.
Okay, so one of, I think, Matthew's weaknesses, and it crosses over into vulnerability, is his like, we had the discussion of how we've been told several times by several different characters in the book that Matthew is attracted to delicate, like, aka weak things, and I don't know that that's so much the case, but he is attracted to vulnerability, and Diana has tons of that, as we've just discussed, but she does not have the self-awareness, so that really plays into, like, he's attracted to that and he wants to, like, protect it and, take care of it and all of those things, but we don't need for Diana to be, like, sheltered and protected. We need her to, like, come to terms with who she is.
Well, I think that his protectiveness I think it comes from a place of intense devotion and loyalty, but because it is tied to his imperiousness and superiority and his need for control, that those character traits lead him to foreclose opportunities for his partner's growth. And I think that he has some really tremendous strengths, and not saying that I have the power to go back in time and not make Matthew a vampire, but having him be the kind of person that is like both like self-punishing and exceptionally long-lived, not a great combination. In the sense that, like, he never, ever cuts himself a break. And as a result, he is always trying to outthink, outmatch, outrun, out-strategize, protect everybody else. Like, he's trying to protect the things that are important to him so hard that he ends up creating more complications and more vulnerabilities vis-a-vis his secrets.
Yeah. Which, I mean, on the one hand, he is a super resilient character, because a less resilient person with that much extensive self-flagellation would have, just turned into a basket case, basically, or a hermit, or, something worse. And Matthew's super resilient, so he has not done that. However, centuries of self-flagellation really doesn't do anyone any favors.
Well, I think that he is... that his strengths include his compassion, his dedication, his experience, his loyalty, the fact that he can be commanding. Like, if you need leadership, Matthew offers a brand of leadership, and that his experience has made him, at his best, he is thoughtful and considerate and charming and empathetic, and the wisdom and the age sits well on him. At the worst of times, he's contemptuous, he's angry, he's secretive, he's superior, he's dismissive, he is domineering, and the vulnerability, I think that there is, maybe a tension between the love of Diana and the fear for her, and then also his shame over his identity, because I don't know that Matthew has ever forgiven himself for being a vampire and forgiven himself for the combination between, like, being a vampire and the fact that he's had an exceptionally long life in which to make mistakes.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, we talked about earlier when we got Matthew's origin story about, the midpoint in the book, how the extent to which it was actually Matthew's choice to become a vampire, and how, like, raging delirium from pain potentially does not give you informed consent. And, how much of that was his choice? If we're talking about vampire ethics, was it really ethically his choice?
Right.
I mean, I come down on the no side of that.
Right.
But,
and we know from the record that Matthew, one of his vulnerabilities / weaknesses is that he loves deeply and to a level of obsession, and that as a result, like, boy can't do grief. He just can't. He is compromised in his ability to grieve and to let things go. Like, he does not have the aspect of surrender and acceptance that makes grief tolerable over time.
Yeah. And because he can live basically forever, he has the capacity to grieve forever, which he will do.
If you give him half a second, he's going to grieve forever.
Yes. Because that is one of his weaknesses and vulnerabilities, is just, whoa, let it go. And now he has eternity to not let things go. And I think going back to the discussion of him, like, taking on leadership, which is absolutely a super important role to have a character who is willing to be a leader, but he is detrimentally willing to be a leader, because we have a protagonist who is absolutely 100% unwilling to be a leader. And so he's basically just enabling her to not do anything.
Right. Matthew the enabler.
Yeah, in this case. And he also, I mean, his leadership capabilities are compromised by some of his weaknesses, his anger, and the fact that he just simply can't think clearly in situations where he needs to.
Correct.
So,
do you think that Matthew experiences a change or a character arc in A Discovery of Witches?
I don't. Well, I think he experiences an almost imperceptible character arc. I mean, he lets somebody in, so yay. That's a growth thing for him. He he is more helpful and more involved. We talk about Matthew like being outside of time and being separate from time, and how he's just kind of like removed himself. So he does become more involved in circumstances that are in the present within this book. Outside of that, not a lot of growth.
And I don't know that that's a negative thing, especially when you have Diana having, even though it's not getting her to where she will eventually be, she makes great strides in this book, and it is absolutely okay to have Matthew be more or less a constant, or to have a flatter character arc, because his arc is basically like plus minus Diana, and I think that his goals certainly shift, but they don't fundamentally change.
And it's fine. I mean, we do a lot in A Discovery of Witches. Like, it's okay. it's okay.
Right, that's not, I think that is more of a comment and a note and something to chew on more than it is a criticism, because I don't necessarily think that we need for Matthew to change to get where we're going at the end of this book. We need Diana to change. She can't get to the end of this book without being a significantly different person from who she was when she started. Shall we talk a bit about antagonists?
Yes. Did you want to talk about masculinity and femininity first?
Ooh.
Or do you want to talk about antagonists?
Maybe we do antagonists first, and then we do masculinity and femininity, or vice versa. I don't care.
I think we can do antagonists first, because I think that will play into the masculinity, femininity conversation, like from both sides of the spectrum.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in terms of antagonists in A Discovery of Witches, you and I generally agreed that there are 3 plots going on. Who do you think is the antagonist of, or the best representation of the antagonist for the Diana and Matthew versus the world and the book story?
So for me, for this book, to me, the antagonist is less a person and more of an entity. And I find the congregation to be the primary antagonist for all 3 of the stories. Well, except for Diana versus herself, really, because she's her own antagonist in that one. But the other 2, the congregation, and they kind of like send emissaries. But as far as people who are sub-congregation, I think
sub-congregational, maybe?
some congregational antagonists, representations of the congregation. I think that we have in Diana versus the world, I would say that it's Peter Knox, and he also motivates other people like Jillian, and Satu to work against him. And then with Diana and Matthew, I feel like it's the congregation still. Yeah. Well, and Juliet for them too. Yeah.
Certainly.
Yeah.
And I think that I agree with you that for Diana versus herself, in those kinds of stories, usually your antagonist is who you were before. It's your own inertia. And I think that that's also true here. And I think that the antagonists generally in A Discovery of Witches suffer somewhat from the same hurdles as the protagonist does, in the sense that it is clear by the end of A Discovery of Witches that we are not getting an answer to the book question. We're not getting an answer to like what's actually going on in this world. And when that is the primary goal of the antagonist, we are removing ourselves slightly from that, and we're not achieving that within the space of one book. We also have a bit of an issue, I think, in terms of the decision to time travel at the end of A Discovery of Witches specifically removes us from the central narrative conflict as we understand it in the first book, which means that I think the structure and plotting of Shadow of Night is really interesting when we get to it.
Yeah, because essentially what it does, it takes away the threat of the congregation, which is brilliant for the characters to decide to do that. Because they're saying basically like, what we need is time, we're going to give ourselves that, we're going to remove the congregation from the picture. As an author, it becomes really difficult for the second book.
Certainly. It becomes difficult in terms of keeping the continuity and the pacing and the engagement of the second book vis-a-vis the first, which I'm sure we'll talk to pieces in Shadow of Night. But it also means that, like, we have these antagonists hanging out there, and for the last couple hundred pages of A Discovery of Witches, like, they really kind of appear once. And the loss of urgency, I think, is something that the series struggles with as a whole, is that we sort of stop and start and stop and start.
Yeah. Because we have Peter Knox, I would say, for the first third, maybe half of the book. We have Satu after that. And then after that, we have Juliet. And then after Juliet is dead, we just kind of have this, like, vague threat of the congregation, but no direct antagonism. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. Which is structurally difficult to work with. Mm-hmm. And provides us with plenty of challenges for the middle book.
Yeah. And, you know, and again, like, it's also part of working with a series and a trilogy is that, you know, like, yes, some of these characters are going to come back later, but right now they've been removed. Like, we've been led to believe that they're super dangerous, but now they're gone. So.
As we talked about in the last episode, it is also a consequence of choosing a story conflict that is world-based as opposed to based on any one individual. Like, the goal and the central narrative conflict is so global that to solve it in one book of this size is also unreasonable. And so this is not to say I think that it's the wrong choice, just that it is a choice that is complicated, because you literally cannot accomplish the thing that the central narrative conflict wants you to do in the course of one book.
Yeah. And to, like, make a concrete example of that, just so if you, like, take a classic conflict, somebody needs to go slay a dragon. The dragon is the threat, like a very physical, real threat to the village, whatever. This person, non-gendered, of course, because anyone can slay a dragon.
And anyone can be a hobbit.
Yeah, needs to go slay said dragon for the conflict to be resolved. They go on their quest, they slay the dragon, and that is the climax. They slay the dragon.
Rest in peace, dragon.
Rest in peace, dragon. Conflict over. The hero goes home. Hooray. We've solved the conflict.
When the conflict is, say, that the entire world is being taken over by darkness, and there are many dragons and other creatures, and you need, you know, one person or one group of people alone is insufficient to stop them, and you have to get the entire world on your side before you can defeat the oncoming darkness. That is a longer conflict, and you can't do that in one book and have it be reasonable.
And it's super intangible as well.
Super intangible. Like, how do you know when you've done it?
I guess we'll find out.
And that, I mean, to some extent, like, that is almost the brilliance of having the conflict in A Discovery of Witches / All Souls be represented by one object. Mm-hmm. Similar in some ways to the Ring of Power in The Lord of the Rings, when you have the central narrative conflict represented by one tangible thing. It helps anchor the intangible goal that you're trying to accomplish.
Yes. Yeah. I'm so happy that we've made other book references in this episode and not just Outlander.
Well, there are no objects in Outlander, really.
There aren't. And The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and the Ring of Power is a way more reasonable representation.
I mean, we could also be looking at, like, Wheel of Time, where there's so many, like, world-changing objects that it's almost obscene, and that part is certainly overdone. Maybe we should have a Wheel of Time podcast.
We bring it up often enough. I mean, we're certainly not having an Outlander podcast. Don't add us about Outlander, you guys.
Maybe that we should put that on a t-shirt.
I feel like that's just an invitation for people to talk to us about Outlander.
Fair. So yeah, I think that the choices that Deb made in constructing this conflict and in constructing these characters do give us a great deal of fuel for 3 books, but it is difficult in the scope of one book to talk about those characters and those issues and those sources of protagonism and antagonism actually being resolved in the space of the book.
Yeah. And I do like, since we're talking about our antagonists, I do like that we get both male and female antagonists. I mean, we talked about the problems with Juliet, and that was a separate conversation, but I do like that we have both. And that the female characters in this book overall can be just as threatening as the male characters in the book, maybe sometimes more so, and maybe sometimes more active in terms of antagonists than Peter Knox, who's not super active.
No, definitely not. Yeah. He's more of like a Tweedy Malevolence.
Yeah.
So that would lead us, I think, into our discussion of masculinity and femininity, which is something that I wanted to bring up, not only because of the theme in the All Souls trilogy, sort of a like cosmic masculine and feminine, light and dark balance, but then also because we had touched on that conversation about Matthew and the toxic masculine in our listener feedback episode. And so I just kind of wanted to circle back to these ideas. And on the one hand, I kind of want to be like, hey, Jen, what do you think about the representation of femininity in the All Souls trilogy? But that's kind of like too large.
Yeah.
And so do we think that this series or that this book has something to say about those two subjects?
I think, generally speaking, the things that it tells us about masculinity and femininity and the things that it shows us about those two things are different.
Explain.
As we talked about a little bit in a couple episodes ago, for example, we have Diana making the comment about testosterone poisoning and how that is not fair to the male characters in the book, and how we have the whole discussion of the representation of the goddess and femininity, and that a lot of our characters who are positive characters, who are on the side of the protagonist, who are witches, are also female. And that we do not actually encounter a lot of male witches, implying that witchery is more feminine. And we also have the idea that that witch bloodlines are matrilineal. So we have that tied in there. However, if we look at the characters, and if we look at like the activity of the characters and the strengths and weaknesses of the characters, I would say overall it's like pretty balanced masculine and feminine, actually. Even though we have the book telling us some things that are a little bit more traditional about masculinity and femininity.
Yeah. Well, and I guess like it is worthwhile, I think, to have a conversation about the All Souls trilogy as representing strengths and weaknesses in male and female characters in a relatively balanced way, in the sense that the strengths and weaknesses of the characters are not overly gendered, but there is certainly a conversation about the value judgment that any piece of any piece of fiction places on more traditionally masculine or feminine traits by whichever in characters they happen to be displayed. And I think that by complicating the male characters, or at least our main male character, sufficiently and making him a damaged person, we can access some of the more complicated things about masculinity in a way that is productive. But it also means that sometimes when we lean particularly into the vampire damsel thing, that I think we get into like a universe of gender essentiality that is not helpful.
Right. Yeah. And at the same time, we have the book telling us, the whole thing with like pack dynamics and how like a male vampire has to be the head of the family. And as we've discussed, there's no reason for that to be true other than the book tells us that it's true, because we know that all of our female vampire characters are certainly capable, like, and well written enough to be the head of the family. There's absolutely no reason, but the book has made a choice. Without a lot of supporting evidence.
Yeah, and I think that maybe there's something to unpack in the representation of witches as largely female and vampires as largely male, and like maybe that leaves the demons in sort of like this weird neuter position, which I don't know that I I don't know that I necessarily care for either the implications of that or the, what that does to the idea of demons being like not wholly and essentially themselves, but some sort of weird ass mix.
Yeah. I mean, we have, since we're on that topic really quickly, we have Hamish, who is a demon, who is a male character, but he is also a gay character, one of our only gay characters in the series. Which, if we're looking at it in terms of the 3 different, like, creature types, is problematic. Because you can almost read it, and I'm absolutely not making a judgment, you guys, about homosexuality or like sexuality in general or the fluidity of sexuality. I'm just saying that the implication could be read in the book that demons are fluid in terms of what they are, because we have a character who is male but who is gay, who is our demon representative in this
and
book.
Perhaps that is balanced by the fact that our other queer characters include Sarah and Em, obviously, who are witches, and later we will have other queer characters who are of a different species origin. But it is kind of a, I don't know. Go
on. Oh, I was going to say, we talked about, like, very early on with Sarah and Em, how it is a bit tropey to have, our 2 female witches be our queer characters in the book. And how that's also problematic.
But I think that it's, I think we just get into some unusually fraught sort of gender politic territory when we have, I think a thematic premise involving the alchemy and involving this like highly reductive version of the masculine and the feminine as a balance and the dark and the light. And when we look at that as like a theme and as a construct in the All Souls trilogy, I think that we end up in a place where like maybe sometimes we stray a little bit into gender essentialism, or where we have things to say about gender that are, I don't know, like maybe just not my favorite.
Yeah. Yeah. And that will continue, by the way, into other, I feel like in Shadow of Night, we don't have that conversation as much, right. But it's certainly going to be there.
And I think that that's also raised by this idea of, Diana being sort of modern and Matthew being sort of old-fashioned and what gender roles look like. But then we also, as you said, have textual evidence of Diana sort of leaning into some of the more traditional, maybe submissive isn't the word, but sort of like secondary following, like Matthew is the head of the family type things. And the book / the series, I think, is more successful when we look at them both on balance, just as people.
Yeah.
So
I agree.
Yeah. Would we like to talk about some of our listener feedback?
Sure. Yeah. Yes. So we wanted to revisit a conversation that we had on Facebook that we thought was really amazing and lovely about Ghost Stephen's statement that love is the strongest magic, which happened way back in LaPierre. If you remember, it was like chapter 27. It was a long time ago. And we were talking about what we thought it meant. And we did revisit that a little bit when we had Sarah's comment about love and magic, but we just want to talk about it a little bit again because we thought one of our listeners had a lot of really interesting and insightful things to say about love being the strongest magic and what that might mean. So this was our listener, Christy. Hello, Christy. So basically saying that that magic has to come from the heart, which we have touched on a little bit before, in that love is what keeps us going, and because we love people, we have desire, right? The desire to protect people because we love them, the desire to see them again because we love them, and that gives us something to fight for in the book and ties into Diana's desire, and so therefore love is the strongest motivation for magic because it ties into desire. The implication is that it ties into desire, if I'm
I think so. And the other thing that we sort of talked about on Facebook was that love is something that supports, encourages, and gives you a reason to use your magic. That the magic that is the most powerful is something that comes from this sort of primal need to see our friends and family again, to keep them safe. And so Christy had this conversation on Facebook about like strongest witches have something to fight for, and that until Diana has Matthew, until she has a place to put her love, she doesn't have one of the basic ingredients for creating sort of strong magic, strong bonds, strong ties.
Right. Yeah. And a little bit too that, which we will be talking about more when we get to the end of the series, but that you have to love yourself to be more, the best person that you can be. Is you really have to embrace and love yourself. And for Diana, that means like becoming the best witch means that she has to accept herself and love herself.
Yeah. It's good stuff.
Yeah.
Our next comment came from our friend of the show, Janine. Hi, Janine.
Hi.
She wanted us to talk a little bit about the interaction in the All Souls trilogy between prophecy and destiny, foreshadowing, seers, and how we think that those play into the plot. So, Jen, what do you think?
Okay, so we have several different pieces. Some of them are literary devices such as foreshadowing, which is that you kind of like imply secretly in the text that something's going to happen, and then it does, right? The most, I guess, like the worst version of this is like the irony cut in TV. It's like the most like prevalent thing that I can think of to demonstrate this, but there's better foreshadowing. It's when like a character says like, what if this happened, and then in the next scene it actually happens. Like,
like when Sarah says that there will be demons showing up on our doorstep before Halloween or whatever, and then sure enough they do.
What is it like? It's either Sarah or Marcus and Marcus is like, oh, we would have 9 people if there were more demons, and yeah. So that's like foreshadowing light. It's much closer to irony than than foreshadowing. So, and then so seers and fate and prophecy and destiny, we have talked a little bit just in terms of time travel and this idea of, what function in the universe has caused Diane and Matthew to end up together. Like, how did these pages get made in the book? What is that about? Is it prophecy? What is it exactly? Was there a seer that saw these two together and put them on page? We don't know. All of those things at this point are certainly a possibility.
Yeah. And I think that it's, to some extent, more powerful to use the prophecy, destiny, seer type device in fiction when you do not also have it sort of abutting time travel. Because, I mean, those two can have a relationship. It's like, does the seer see Matthew and Diana because they literally saw Matthew and Diana? Or does that happen because they go back? Does it happen before they go back? Is that prophecy related to them going back? I
don't know. Makes it really complicated.
Is it really a prophecy? Because it's not like somebody said, and on this day, the so-and-so will do the such and such, and yada yada, the world will end or succeed.
Versus, I actually saw these people in the past, and I know that they were from the future, and I know that they were going to do these things, and therefore I'm going to make a book about it, or, whatever. Not that we're saying that a seer made the book. That's not what we're saying. But just like weighing all of the options. Yeah, I don't think we have enough information at this time about Ashmole 782 and about the function of seers and prophecies. We know that they exist. We know that Rebecca was a really powerful seer and that she saw a lot of, what was going to happen, particularly with Sarah and Matthew. And that's how they kind of like designed this spell. And we also know that Diana does have that ability as well to see into the past and potentially the future. I mean, she has the genetics to do it. We know she has it. So I think we need more information on the function of seers in the world of All Souls.
I agree. And the question of, like, how much of what is happening is determined by something that has already happened, or, like, how much of the sort of, like, gears of the universe were always moving Matthew and Diana together. Because I think that there's a tension in the series between, like, their own sort of, like, gravity between them and the idea that they were destined to be together, and that, you know, everyone knows that this was always going to happen. So, you know, what do we have that shows us what happens after?
Versus how much of it is happening because time travel.
I don't know. That might be one of those things, Janine, where we're just gonna, like, be like, meh, we'll see.
We'll hold on to it, though. Like, when it comes up, because I know that we've touched on it a little bit before, but I think we'll have to continue to keep an eye on it and see where we come down on it. Yeah.
So if you were to look at the entirety of A Discovery of Witches, and you were to identify some themes, what do you think this is a story about?
I think...
If you're writing a book report, which is essentially what we've done over the course of the last 20 hours of audio.
I know. This is the best book report we've ever done.
Certainly the most extensive.
Certainly the most extensive, yes. I would say for this book, identity is like one of the biggest themes that we deal with. Yeah. Identity and trauma, although that one is very subtle, I would say. But I would say it's certainly a theme for all of our characters. And some other ones. I mean, family.
I think that there is also a theme, like the identity theme is related to that this is a story of becoming, and that, like, our first sort of segment of that story is, like, how did Diana become the Diana that she is now, and how will she begin to be the Diana that she'll be in the future? So identity and becoming, which is also related to family. But then I think that we are also talking about responsibility and accountability and honesty as things that are not only necessary for the building and functioning of a family, but are necessary for your relationship with yourself.
Yeah, because we frequently in the book have characters who either refuse to accept responsibility, or they accept too much responsibility, sometimes in error. And with the example of Matthew, who takes responsibility for everything, even though it's not his fault. So, and Diana being the opposite of that, basically. And I think part of taking responsibility is accepting your identity and accepting your responsibility within your identity of who you are and what that requires of you. Yeah. Do we have any other
good stuff?
Things? I think that's all of the major themes for the book, basically. Yeah.
Certainly, but we would be curious to hear from any of our listeners if they have additional thoughts on what those themes look like. So shall we talk about our polls?
Yes. I would say love is another theme.
Well, yes. Yeah. I can't believe we forgot that one. Whoopsies. This is a romance after all. And we forgot the romance part.
Yeah. So love, all the different types of love. Love of family, love of friends, love of your significant other, etc. All the problematic types of love. Anyway, now we can talk about polls.
And the problems that love causes.
All the problems.
All the problems.
So many problems.
Love, is it worth the trouble?
We'll find out in the next few books.
Stay tuned.
So
polls.
Yeah, we're gonna wind down this discussion with some fun things that we have been doing. We've been running some listener polls for a little bit since we started our Facebook group. Most of them have been on Facebook. Some of them have also been on Twitter. And I will tell you that is not because all of you on Twitter aren't lovely, because you are, but that Twitter only allows you to have 4 poll choices. And most of these polls required 5+ choices, and it only lets you vote once, and Facebook lets you vote for as many things as you want. which
it's
is
more fun to do polls.
It's more
on Facebook.
fun. It's more sporting because who wants to pick favorites? I just want to pick like 3 things I really like.
And the polls on Facebook are indefinite, whereas Twitter, you have to set an amount of time. So the beauty of the polls on Facebook is that we might check the results later and see whether anybody who joins our Facebook group has different opinions.
Yeah. So, okay, so we have a few different things. So the first ones we can talk about are the character polls that we did. Then we started running super early. So I had a poll for best supporting character, separated male and female. So we have best supporting female character, which it was no contest. It was my boo, Izzy Boo. Miriam was number 2, but by like 1,000 votes. Not really, that was hyperbole, but it was not a contest.
Team Isabeau.
Team Isabeau. And the male supporting character was actually super close and has been like vacillating between Marcus and Hamish. So today when I looked, Marcus was winning that poll. But earlier when I looked, Hamish was winning that poll. And they've been duking it out in that poll, and I'm sure it's going to change again. It's very close.
We should make a note, and we'll check that one at the end of every book.
Yeah. We'll just let it keep going. So you guys know it's there if you haven't voted on it. Marcus or Hamish, guys. And then I also had a poll for best minor character. And at the...
But this one spans the entire series, right?
No, it's just for this book.
Oh, really?
These were just for A Discovery of Witches. Not account. That's why your favorite was not there. That's why Fernando wasn't on the poll.
You're right.
Yeah.
Salt in the wound. Got it.
Salt in the wound. Yeah, so these are best minor characters and best supporting characters just for A Discovery of Witches. So Amira won our best minor character, and Timothy the Demon was second, and Jordan, Hamish's butler, was third.
I do like Jordan.
But that's only because I voted for him. And if you're wondering... And one other person, I think. And that's how he ended up getting third.
Probably because people were like, who is Jordan?
I said Jordan, Hamish's butler, on the poll.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
Like, I wasn't just like Jordan without description. If you're wondering how I chose supporting versus minor character, because 2 of those characters are kind of contentious, and I feel like people could argue by either way. Like, I put Chris as a supporting character, but I put Amira as a minor character. And guess what, guys? It's just because I'm the one who made the polls. Really, my requirements for
boss.
My requirements for supporting character were for A Discovery of Witches. They have a name. Yes. They have words. Yes.
They say something.
And they assist the protagonist in a fundamental way. That's how I chose supporting character. Minor character, they have a name. They may or may not have words.
Right.
And they may just like show up and then disappear. That's a minor character. So if you're wondering how I differentiated between those 2 things and why Amir is a minor character but Chris is a supporting character, those are the things I used to decide who was who.
It's our podcast. We get to do what we want.
Basically. And that poll is also still open. There are so many choices in the minor characters. I went through the book and I picked every single named character in A Discovery of Witches who was a minor character.
It was a very slow Sunday.
It was. I mean, I have Pete, the boathouse manager, on there as well.
Team Pete.
Team Pete.
I know you're out there, Team Pete.
Uh-huh. I have the valet.
Yeah.
At Diana's Lodge. There are a lot of random characters in the minor characters list. Okay, so we had a fun one on here that was favorite location in the Bishop house. And that ended up being the still room. Lots of people really like the still room.
Yeah,
I think kitchen was next.
A lot of time.
Yeah, I think kitchen was next. Like kitchen, living room were also like pretty high on that poll.
Right.
Let's see. Should I do the serious ones first, or should I do the random fun ones? Should I get the serious ones out of the way?
Yeah, I think we should do a mix.
A mix.
Like maybe a little serious and a little fun.
Okay, so we're having a poll on Facebook about our discussion with the reason that the goddess appears when at the end of the book, like the reasoning for the appearance of the goddess, and we had several options on there, all of which we had discussed on that podcast episode of the possible reasons why the goddess showed up at this time. If you don't remember those reasons, you can go back and listen to that episode. Which is The Price is Right? ? I believe is that one.
Right.
So the overwhelming answer that people agreed to was that she appeared because Diana's desire to save Matthew called her. And second on that was, but it wasn't really a contest between the two, was she appeared because she was always meant to appear. Which goes back into our fate conversation, right?
Right.
So that was out. And I think, I can be on board with that one. I actually could be on board with any of the choices that we put up there, but I think...
That's why you designed them that way.
I wrote the polls, guys, all of them. So.
No, I think I might have added one.
Did you? Oh, yeah. Yes, you did.
Aha!
Yeah. Yes, you did.
Pulling my weight.
Are you pulling your weight or are you pulling your weight?
I see what you did there.
This is why you keep me around.
I keep you around because you're purdy too.
Oh, thanks. So that was a more serious one that we had about a serious conversation. We also had cookies you would most like M to bake for you. Overwhelmingly chocolate chip.
I voted for ginger snaps.
Ginger snap was second. And then I think shortbread and peanut butter were after that. Sad oatmeal raisin didn't get any votes, guys.
I love oatmeal raisin cookies.
You didn't vote. You voted for ginger snaps. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Anyway, I mean, chocolate chip, I would like M to bake me any cookies, really. I would basically eat any cookies. Or sugary nuts that M chooses to put in front of me. So another more serious one. So Diana's reasoning behind asking to be turned into a vampire, which is another discussion that we had on the podcast. So we made a poll to get our listener feedback on that. And overwhelmingly people said, which I tend to agree with, Diana is not in a place to make rational decisions. And she said some real stupid stuff.
Right. She was very, very traumatized at that point.
It's regrettable, and I tend to agree with that. Yeah. And then we have quinces, ? Yes, no, or still confused. Most people are still confused about quinces and can't make a yes or no choice. After that, people are in Kate's yes boat, and 3 wonderful souls are on the no quinces boat with me.
Well, if that's how the cookie crumbles, I had to resist giving an entire list of quince recipes, and still do, because I will defend quinces. I don't know if that's the hill that I will die on, but I'll come very close.
And it's fine. Love what you love.
Eat what you want.
Eat what you want. I feel like that's a good website post thing in all of our spare time. Is quince recipes.
Maybe I will do that for this year's real-time reading. Yeah. Although this year I also want to do real-time reading posts for Shadow of Night.
Okay.
So I'll probably do a lot of reposts for the Discovery of Witches real-time reading, and then new posts for Shadow of Night.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. What else do we have here? We have type of time traveler. What type of time traveler? We had a lot of different options. Most people picked the Diana Bishop method of time travel, which is to visualize a place and step into it, which I like. I think it's very nice, non-traumatic, which some of those options were a lot more dramatic and traumatic. Yeah. So, yeah, I did neglect to put time travel device TARDIS. Yeah, that was my bad, guys. Sorry. As I said before, I don't watch Doctor Who. Don't hurt me. Let's see. What else we have? Oh, butter versus margarine versus mayo.
Is
R.E.
anyone actually
Buttergate.
on Team Mayo? Oh.
You know what? No. Thankfully.
Yeah, that's a conversation we haven't had, but I deeply dislike mayo.
But it's a thing, right? We both agree that's a thing that people in the South will put on toast.
For sure.
Yes,
sure.
Because we did have some listeners who were confused about that people would actually put that on toast in lieu of butter and mayo, and the answer is absolutely yes, or Miracle Whip. which is possibly worse.
Ugh, they're both bad.
Yeah. But everybody who voted in the butter, margarine, mayo poll chose butter. So thanks, guys.
Because butter is superior.
Butter is superior. We all need it, want it, and desire it.
That is a conversation for another time. Oh, wait. We already had it.
We already had it. And then, let's see. Ooh, you asked about people's type of magic. Because Diana has so many options available to her in terms of her abilities in magic. And for a while, telekinesis was at the top of this poll. And now it is spells and charms.
It would be nice to move shit with my brain. This is
true. Yeah. But right now, spells and charms is winning and telekinesis is second. But they've been going back and forth. So. And the last thing, I think it's the last thing. It's a very long list of polls. Things that people are most excited about from the World of All Souls book coming up here very shortly, and that is info on minor and or deceased characters.
Yeah, and we will see what we get from that when it is released on Tuesday, May the 8th, which this episode will actually post after that book comes out.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll have to talk about it at another time, obviously. We have some other books that we have to talk about.
Indeed, which would be a good place to talk about when we will start Shadow of Night and announce our... Yeah, look at you segueing. And then announce our schedule for Shadow of Night.
Yes. Yeah. So this will be coming out on May 13th. And then we decided, as we've told you guys before, that we want a couple weeks to collect our thoughts, discuss, and decide on our release schedule and our reading schedule, particularly since Shadow of Night is going to run into the release of the TV show, so we need to figure out logistics for that. So we are looking at our first Shadow of Night episode to be Sunday, June the 3rd of this year, 2018.
So mark your calendars, get your copies of Shadow of Night out. That will give you some time to enjoy the World of All Souls and to make some notations in Shadow of Night. If you have any additional feedback for Discovery of Witches or Shadow of Night, or really anything you want to talk to us about the World of All Souls, then you should get in touch with us. We also wanted that time because we are continuing to plan and get ready for our presentation at All Souls Con. And if you are still interested in attending that either in person or online, you should go to allsoulscon.org and book your attendance.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're super excited, A, to have finished this book and finished our discussion, and B, to begin Shadow of Night discussion with you guys. Woo! It's a whole new world.
A whole new world indeed. If you want to get in touch with us in the meantime, you can find us at our email address, which is, of course, chamomileandclovecast@gmail.com. You can follow us on Twitter, chamomile in as in November, clove. You can find us on our website, which is chamomileandclovecast.wordpress.com.
Mm-hmm. You can find us on Facebook, either for our show Facebook page, which is where we post the episodes and stuff, and that is Chamomile and Clove Podcast on Facebook, or at our discussion group, the Chamomile and Clove Clovers, which is where you get to participate in all of these polls, and also where I've been posting different examples of time travel in fiction, just like to keep y'all busy in between episodes. So Indeed. Go over and join our Facebook page to discuss other stuff with us if you want to. And yeah.
As always, thank you for playing with us. Thank you for being our loyal and supportive audience. And we look forward to speaking to you again on June 3rd.
Yay!
And in the meantime, you can find us on Facebook, on Twitter, by email, and other means and methods. So you should do that. Get in touch. Let us know what you think. Let us know if there's anything you want us to particularly cover in Shadow of Night. And in the meantime, we might make some plans about All Souls Con. And if you want to hear about that, then we will make those announcements via Twitter and Facebook.
Yay! Thank you guys for listening.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.